Frost Valley YMCA as an 18-year-old gappy, and had an absolute ball, and that opened my eyes to the outdoors and to what I wanted to do. I've been there for many years, and in the year 2000 I was moving my way into sort of mid-management and more administrative work, and I got a phone call on the first day of June 2000 that would pretty much change my trajectory forever. You could hit the next one. This was a beautiful place in the Catskills, and if you look at this picture, you probably get some feelings of beautiful calm, beautiful river. And unfortunately, this is a place where a teacher who was visiting our program lost her footing, fell in the river, and ended up drowning. And I remember clearly going out there, getting the call, and running out there a couple of Ks or mile and a half, and having my eyes open. I think I was 24 at the time, and having my eyes open to this just tragedy unfolding in front of me. And I can remember coming back in. It was quite an extended rescue, and I remember coming back in, and one thing sticks out in my mind vividly. I remember the phones ringing, like going crazy. The word had got out, and I can remember my boss at the time, the executive director. He'd been there for 35 years, and it was the New York Times on the phone. And they basically, you can imagine what they were saying. Tell us what happened. We've heard this really bad thing has happened. And this guy was silver tongue. Like, he was amazing. I can remember what he said to them, and he changed the whole nature of the conversation really quickly. But my 24-year-old mind at that point said, that was awesome, and I didn't have a word for it, but now I understand the word or the words to be key person dependent. I don't think any of the rest of us could have done that. We didn't have a plan. We didn't really know what we were doing in terms of we did the best we could with what we had. And the executive director did a phenomenal job, but I started asking these questions in my own head. What if he wasn't here? And that, pretty much that day, changed my trajectory. There wasn't even a turn for it, but I decided at 24 I wanted to be a risk manager in the outdoors. And there's some people in the room here who were the risk managers in the outdoors at that time. And there was about 3 of you. There weren't many. It was not really a niche. Yeah, it was a niche. It wasn't really written in the job descriptions. So I had no idea how to get into this, but I started reading, and I booked a ticket to Reno. And as you see here on the left-hand side of this, or on this picture, I got my hands on all the past proceedings. And hopefully you'll see on the top of that picture, you'll see all the dog-eared pages with all the little sticky notes in. So I started reading. I'm like, I'm gonna read that again. Yeah, that's interesting. I'd highlighted everything. And I just kind of became obsessed with this stuff. And at that stage, I didn't think I'd be all that successful by applying to organizations like the 3 wonderful founding organizations for the WRMC. They'd probably look at a 25-year-old kid and go, are you kidding? I'm not giving you that job. And so I heard of this place. I'd worked with some Australians, and Aussies are all over the world. There's an Aussie, where's Mike? There he is. And I'd worked with these Aussies in the US, and they'd said, Clare, you should come and work at a place called the Outdoor Education Group. I'm like, I've never heard of it, looked it up. I don't even know if we had Google back then. But anyway, this job, somebody told me this job had come up. You should apply for it. It's called a National Safety Officer. And I went, oh, okay, give that a crack. I don't know what it is, but I'll give it a go. And I applied, and the thing I liked about it was at that stage it was only 2 days a week. So 3 days, or the equivalent, I could be in the field. So I really still wanted to be in the field. I wanted to be cold, wet, tired, and hungry, and I wanted to work with young people. But I wanted to get into this risk stuff, and I just didn't know how. So I applied for this job. For some reason, they hired me. I was able to do the Irish gift of the gab, got on a ticket, and quite ironically, on a Qantas plane. And it's the safest airline in the world, by the way. So in case you're wondering, 2 bags, 2 bikes, and made my way to Melbourne, Australia. Started that job, and I was absolutely floored. If you can just hit the next slide, that'd be wonderful. I got there, and I thought I'd throw in some Aussie pictures, but I was terrified. I was like, surely this, I'm not qualified. I started to get the wobbles. I started to go, this is nuts. Like, I've talked my way into something that I'm not going to get out of this very easily. I was really worried. I felt it was a large organization. Back then, we were working with about 8,000 kids a year, quite a lot of staff. So it was a very large place. And I had a case of the wobbles, so I went to my boss, Sue, and I said, Sue, I'm a bit nervous. I'm not like I haven't been climbing big river or paddling big rivers and climbing big mountains for 30 years. I don't know if this is going to work. And she said that to me. She basically was clear about what they wanted. And I decided, okay, well, I can give this a go. Next slide, please. And I decided, no pressure, just go for it, give it a crack. And I got into it, and I kept, again, reading as widely as I could. Next slide, please. And I read a lot of this stuff. For those of you who know Deb Ayango, I got my hands on all of Deb's books, and wonderful books, case studies, and read and read and read. And interestingly, then I decided, there's certainly, this is not by no means the only outdoor risk management books, there were certainly others. But then I decided there didn't seem to be that many, so I started to try and find some other areas or other books that looked at this stuff. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, go back one. There you go. So the middle was all these other books on risk. And so they became then the sort of, coffee table reading time or bedtime, a few chapters. And I started to read right outside of the areas, I suppose, or that was the real interest in where that sprung, in reading outside of other areas, industrial areas. There's a book in here, Reb, I can see him. There's a book in here that Reb, about 8 years ago, he recommended to me. And I'll never forget the conversation. He said, "Have you read this?" And I went, "I haven't." And I went and bought it and read it on the plane on the way back to Melbourne. So don't ever doubt if anybody says something to you or gives you some advice, you will probably take it. And I decided at that stage, I still felt like I needed a bit of credibility. I remember a board member when I first got the job, and he looked at me with utter terror when he went, "You guys hired this kid?" And so I felt like I needed some credibility. And that was a real challenge for me. And I'm not sure if that's still the issue today. I think there's a lot more of us working in this area. But it was something I felt I had to do. So I went and did started a master's degree in risk, crisis, and disaster management. And that's where I really got interested in communicating risk. This whole area had been around for a long time in other areas like nuclear, not in my backyard, these types of high hazard areas. And I thought this area has a lot to teach us. The areas around informed consent, around the deficit model, how do we actually talk more about the benefits? How do we get comfortable talking about the benefits and balancing those with the risks? Because we know that society is actually willing to suffer or accept risk if they understand the benefits. And I think that's something that we're getting a lot better at, but it's certainly something we can do a lot more work on. Perhaps something for you to take away or think about is how often and how much do you talk about the benefits? And do that, put it all over the place. Next slide, please. All of that, and all that reading and all, sort of settling into the job. I was only in the job 2 years, and my life in many ways got turned upside down again. Tragedy again hit. This is Alice, and Alice was 16 when tragically her tree was hit by her tent was hit by a falling tree on one of our programs in 2005. And I remember receiving the phone call back with Laura, and it was Laura who'd lost her life in the Catskills. I was a field staff. I was a young fieldie. Here was very different. Here I was in a position of real responsibility, and someone had lost her life on what I considered my watch. And it was the child in the tent beside her walked away. And so this was a really tragic, obviously, incident that had happened, and there was lots and lots of investigations that occurred, made massive news. It was big news for a long time, and it really impacted the sector in Australia surrounding the hazards associated with tree fall. I can vividly remember us trying to get a plane to send the family down. It was an 8-hour drive to the site, and we couldn't get a plane. The pilot said they wouldn't fly in that weather. But interestingly, at 6:30 the same morning, there was 3 news choppers in the area. So the speed, and again, we seemed to go in that time where the speed of everything was just magnifying, and even more so today. And I guess with Alice, that really set me on this. I felt as a practitioner, as a risk manager, such shame. Like, I can't tell you how, and I'm sure hopefully for some of you in the room this doesn't conjure up or trigger you, but it was an absolute, how could I, and the guilt of that, how could I possibly feel bad, or how could I have, acknowledged feelings that I had when here's this family, parents, 3 sisters that don't have their daughter and their sister. So it was a really dark time, and it caused me to really think. I think I looked at every job under the sun, including making coffee and doing risk in war zones. I was willing to do anything. I just wanted to run fast as I could. And I guess I understand now, in a lot of ways through my academic work, why. Second victims, and Todd talked about this. There's a lot of us sitting in this room, and there's a lot of us who work in this profession who are second victims, because we feel that it was our job to keep people and bring them home, to look after them and bring them home. And whatever happened, for whatever reasons, that didn't occur in some cases, or if some people got seriously injured. And this notion of second victims and Decker, Jeff spoke to him, really opened my eyes to this. And the ability to just talk about it, I can still vividly remember organizing our emergency response plan, and I was running around doing lots of different things over the next couple of weeks after it happened. And I remember the psychologist ringing me. We'd organized all this trauma counseling and different counseling for our staff. And I remember the counselor ringing me one night at like 7 p.m. and I was on, full on, go, go, go. I said, so you've organized this and you've done this for this person, you've done this. She said, yeah, Claire, but what about, how about you and I have a chat? I'm like, nope, too busy, can't go, can't deal with that right now. And I can remember I did that for quite a while. And do you know who I started to speak to? Literally about 8 months afterwards, at this conference, Debayango. I couldn't speak to anyone else about it. I had to feel like I was in a community of people who wouldn't judge me and who understood. And that's the impact of a conference like this, or people who come to this conference. So it was a couch in Burlington, Vermont, I think. We've had a conference there, haven't we? Yep. I wasn't just dreaming that. I could have been. And I remember sitting on this couch with Debayango, and some of you will know a lot of Deb's work. And I remember sitting there and she sat me down. She's like, sit down, Dallat. And she said, start talking. And she said, and keep talking. And I just talked and talked and talked. And in many ways, it was my lifeline. It was my lifeline of staying in a field that I loved. And it was my lifeline in recovering and going on to actually make meaning from it. Yep. And this is some photos of, I wasn't going to mention the cycling, but this was in Alaska. And it was my highest heart rate ever, and Debayango was there. So I think it was 218. Maybe the next one. And then all that thinking about risk and how communicating risk and how we're thinking a bit bigger about things, how other factors other than the decisions that the instructor might make, how those things might contribute to incidents, they never prepared me for when it got up and close. This is my dad. And my dad went in 2011 for a routine operation, at least that's what he was told. And there was a whole series of mix-ups. And unfortunately, 2 years later, he passed away from what happened on the operating table. And interestingly, a few things came out of that, but essentially the long story and the tragic story short is that a series of kind of screw-ups on the day and mix-ups on the day led to him bleeding out, led to him, 42 Celsius, whatever that is, it's a lot in Fahrenheit. And unfortunately, his life was changed forever from that and suffered long-standing illness and injuries from it. And 2 years later, he passed away at 60. And I can remember that really vividly, getting on a plane, flying home, and thinking about this, and a lot of anger that ensued from especially my mum, and my sister and two brothers. And I remember there was this real uneasy feeling with me. Obviously, I'd lost my dad. It was a horrendous time. But I remember thinking, there's more to this. This can't be as simple as just this blame on the table. Or, interestingly, in many ways, we got the whole no comment, we didn't screw up. So we got that, but that's a whole other area. That's sort of the risk communication of like, you don't have to, surely we can do better than this. And I still remember the feeling, how it felt when you're told that as a family member. And it really connected to me, I suppose, as an outdoor educator and as a risk manager, how not to do things. But it also got me very interested in this field of human factors and essentially how we optimize human performance and how we optimize systems and design of systems and teams to get optimal performance. And I knew what happened that day on the operating table wasn't. I knew that there were mistakes, but I knew that they were more than the nurse hitting the wrong button and giving them the wrong medication. There was a lot more, and those risks are created well upstream. So it almost became, again, this, I didn't have a choice. I had to follow this. And what it really taught me, and what I think about a lot, and it came to me one day, I was thinking, we're really good at downstream safety. How many paddlers in the room? Anyways, know that. You're going to go set downstream safety? What about the upstream safety? Let's look at that. Let's look at how decisions and actions made upstream might contribute or might actually help facilitate an easier process or an easier role or an easier job for those of our staff who are downstream. And so that essentially set me on a bit of a wavelength again. Jeff was right. I broke my hip. Silly accident at 12k an hour. What's that? 6k an hour, 6 miles an hour. They always say going fast is bad for you, but going slow is really bad. And so I fell off and I broke my hip, and I was lying on a couch for a long time and in a wheelchair, and that throws your life into disarray because you're like, well, what about my identity? So my identity had been tied up as, this cyclist and traveling around the world and all this for a while, and now it suddenly went, well, who are you? And so what else do you do when you have nothing to do? But I ran into some people that I enjoyed working with, and I started a PhD. And that PhD led me to look up and out. And that's where this sort of language comes from. I was really interested in what other domains knew about accident causation, first of all. What do we understand about the multiple factors that contribute and actions that contribute when accidents happen? And then what do we do about it? And what I was interested in is a big study that we're doing in Australia, and we've been doing it since 2009, where we got a government grant, a research grant, to essentially develop an incident database that was underpinned by the most contemporary thinking in safety science. So we essentially, and that's at this point systems thinking. And so we essentially we got some funding to design this incident database, collect incident data, and that would really help us identify the multiple factors or contributory factors and the interactions that led to those incidents. But what got me really interested is after a number of incidents in Australia and the Commonwealth countries, you have this thing called, and here you have it too, OSHA. Occupational health and safety legislation in Commonwealth countries is what they first, if you have an incident in a workplace, which the outdoors is considered a workplace, the authorities will come in and they'll want to know to what extent you ensured the safety as far as reasonably practicable. So they'll essentially look at that and they'll determine the steps that you took. And the first thing they always ask for is your risk assessment. Show me another term we can use for this is, let's say, accident prevention strategies. Show me your risk assessment, show me where you thought about this type of risk and what you did to mitigate it. And what I kept finding was that this thing was just about as useful as, drawing a face picture and putting it in a drawer. Because essentially we did it for compliance. We ticked the box and then we stuck it in a drawer. It didn't influence practice in any way. And so I got interested in the question, do the same approaches that we take to understand accidents, are they actually the same approaches or the same theoretical underpinning that we use to prevent them in the first place? So essentially, how we understood accidents after they happened, is that actually the same as what we do beforehand? And that led to the PhD, and the PhD was again focused on systems thinking. So it was using this theory, which, as you can read up there, looks at multiple factors, multiple levels, and Jeff has given a really nice intro into it. And one of the things that was really interesting, you could see from the slide here, this is, you don't need to read what's actually in it, but this is actually a map of the lead outdoor activity or outdoor education system in Australia. And right down the bottom, you'll see that there's the bottom is the environmental conditions, the meteorological conditions, the equipment being used. The level above that is, for example, who's in the field, the participants, the instructors, other groups around. And most of our focus I believed, on risk assessments and in accident prevention focused on the behaviors and actions of those factors. That makes sense. So the equipment, we hear it all the time, people, equipment, environment, or the P approach. And so, but we know from the actors, this is an actor map, we know that there's all these other actors involved from the law, the legal, from parents, from managers, from park managers or land managers, all the way through. So there's a lot more that makes up the system and a lot more potential areas of foreseeable risk. So that's kind of the theory behind it. So I'm going to try and do this in 1 minute. And so the PhD really, and Jeff's given a bit of an overview of it, but really what we looked at is to what extent do the methods that are in our sector, LOA just stands for lead outdoor activity, and other sectors, what extent are they underpinned by the most contemporary understanding in safety science as to how accidents happen? And I went away in a cupboard for 8 months, didn't come out for air. I got fed through the door, and I evaluated 342 methods. And I found that less than 1% were underpinned by the most contemporary understanding. So this was a wider problem, it wasn't just us. Then I decided to look at how do practitioners, what are the challenges that we have in methods and processes around accident prevention and risk assessment. And we were really, essentially the findings, we had 100 odd people, the findings were we're really confused, we're not sure what's expected of us. We don't know to what extent you go, like for example, do you identify every single risk? We ran into that a lot, oh, well, I perceive that light could fall from the ceiling. Yeah, okay, let's get realistic here. But that was one of the real challenges around risk assessment. It became if there's not boundaries around it, it became very easy for it to spread out and become then merely a compliance ticking exercise. So we were really, as practitioners in our work, we're confused, we don't know what's expected, and we do two key things when we identify risk. We essentially focus on our experience, so we're essentially going, we only can identify what we've either personally experienced or what we've read about or heard. So, and then secondly, we're thinking up risks. And that's really, again, related to what we've read, what we've understood, what my friends sitting here have talked about, and what I've heard about in other programs. We actually lack an anchor through which to identify risks. Okay, or hazards, let's call them that. We can go into the terminology later, but essentially we lack an anchor. And I'll show that a bit. If I was to say to you, let's go for a paddle on the river out the front here, and let's go tonight, or let's go during the day, let's make it easy. We're going during the day, we're taking a few boats out there, let's go for a paddle. If I was to ask you to identify, 4 hazards for that, related to that, and I asked 10 people, would I get 10 different answers? Yeah, I would. I'd get some the same, you would expect that. But I'd get now, some people could go, that's not a bad thing. And sometimes it's actually not, but we need to have an anchor. What about if we miss something foreseeable, for example? And so that's where the net harms process came into, was essentially we wanted to try and create something that was actually anchored in the tasks related to the design stages of a program, the planning stages, the delivery phase, and the review phase. Most of our risk assessment processes, and interestingly our accident investigation sometimes focuses just on the delivery or the actions of the people at the sharp end. Make sense? So we started to essentially look at the design and planning. And the task that was the most, Jeff talked about one task that was most linked. Interestingly, that task was consider or determine participant characteristics. Think about that for a second. And interestingly, if you have a look at what's on the schedule, we focus a lot on that. It's an area of real challenge for us. But that was the one task that if that's not handled completely or appropriately in whatever way you want to use that, 150 emergent risks are created. The good news is, if you get that right, bam, you're off. So again, thinking about that, there's some really interesting things that came out of that, and that was quite new for us. Then we did some reliability and validity testing on it, and what we showed, which was fascinating, was we tested it with people who had no idea about outdoor education, but they knew systems thinking. They were human factors professionals, and we tested on outdoor educators who had no background thinking in systems thinking. And what came out of that, we did a number of retests, and what came out of that was very, very similar results. The outdoor educators were slightly better, but not by a huge amount. So there's a lot of interesting things in that. The last thing that came out of that was the people who took part in the tests, we actually included, and I can see it here in the room, we included people at upper management, we included people at mid-management, we included field instructors. We included essentially your system of your organizational system. And interestingly, we got way more, when we did that, we got way more risks identified, credible risks identified across. Makes total sense, right? How would you expect a CEO or a executive director to understand risks that they don't deal with or interact with every single day? And exactly the same goes for a field instructor. Is it fair to expect a field instructor who comes in on Monday morning or Saturday or whatever it is to actually understand the planning risks? But we know that the planning risks were the most frequent. This thing came out, I love this term, and this came out a fair bit from the research as well, local rationality. Get you to just grab the next one. I love this one because I think about you could get a bit more, we don't go to work to go, well, today's a good day to screw it up. Today's a good day to have a bad thing happen. Rather than asking the question, I don't know about you, but I used to do this all the time. When something would happen or I get a phone call, some incident occurred, I go, what the hell were they thinking? Why did they do that? Why did they make that decision? Why did they act like that? Essentially, I now ask, I have it right on my desk, why did it make sense for that person to do, say, feel, think that at the time? The concept of local rationality means it makes perfect sense to the person at the time. Makes sense, right? You don't go out to have a bad day at work. There's very, very, and that's where sometimes I think we get caught up a bit. Oh, that person, what the hell? So I think maybe, again, one takeaway or action step, is maybe think about adopting something like that, which takes the focus away from the behavior of the individual and tries to understand what was motivating that in the first place. So I'm going to finish with a few lessons learned, I suppose, and that's what got me thinking about this wonderful honor to accept this. There's a lot of second victims. Reach out, don't judge. We all feel bad enough. Don't judge. Do your best to not run. I'm glad I didn't go and make coffee for a living. I love coffee, I don't want to make a living from it. But I'm glad, and it was people at this conference, and who are dear friends since, that sat my backside down and said, talk. Don't underestimate the impact that you can have on people. Don't ever underestimate that in this world. This is a tribe. There is no doubt. And people outside this tribe, my mom today, I was talking to her on the phone, she thinks I work, she doesn't know what I do. You're probably the same. She's probably horrified right now. So, yeah, don't underestimate, and this is your tribe. Don't try and not get into the habit, or try and not get into the defensiveness. When it hits the fan, it's going to be really easy to do that because you want to run for cover. You want to batten down the hatches. Try not to, because in the end, by talking, by being open to change. When we had the incident in 2005, when Alice lost her life, there was all these investigations, and they basically, there was no fault, no blame on behalf of the organization. That didn't, I can remember that, in one hand, you're going, oh, great. And you should. You should do that, and you should be pleased about that, and you should absolutely celebrate the fact that someone else has said that, because it means a lot as a practitioner who takes the role really seriously. But don't stop there. I'd encourage you to go, what can I get from this? What about if I get a bunch of people together with, again, no judgment, and go, what do you think we can do here? If this were to happen tomorrow, or if, these few variables had changed, is there something else that we could do to improve it? Don't stop, and share. Incident data and incident learnings, we know now from our studies, and more and more studies are telling us that the trajectory of minor incidents have very, very similar characteristics to catastrophic incidents. The old thought of just don't bother with your minor, in my view, we have a moral obligation to be reporting our incidents and sharing them. We know, hear that again, we know that the trajectory is very, very similar. Therefore, it shouldn't take a catastrophic incident to learn and share. Look up and out. The pot here is all about interactions and the pan and what's in the pan. Look up and out for, look beyond what's in here. Look beyond in front of your face. Don't focus solely on the behavior of the instructor or the participants, because that's the low-hanging fruit. That doesn't mean that your instructor isn't vital. Of course they are. Your field staff, and as Todd said, this isn't an either or. This is all up. Your staff are part of your system, but they're not all of your system. Absolutely, do not take your focus off judgment, decision-making, all that stuff, but don't stop there. And I think this is a big one. I remember I was bloody terrified the first time I came here in 2002. I was absolutely terrified, and if it hadn't been for a couple of people, I remember Preston Klein, I remember a couple others, I remember Reb, I remember a heap. I remember Deb, Oyango, and others who I could talk to. I felt comfortable. I felt comfortable talking to them because they made me feel comfortable. Ask yourself, are you making people who've just got here for the first time feel comfortable? Risk management is one of those funny things, because we are all not sure if we're doing it right. There's no book. There's lots of books now. That's the problem, there's too many. But we don't know if we're doing it right. We get caught in this subjectivity. So just open your mouth and share. But if you've been here a few times, open your arms. Let people come in. Don't get in your groups. Because that's a really key takeaway. If you want some time out on your own, great. But otherwise, don't sit on your own. And I think the final thing I'd like to I'd like to sort of share with you, and this is, this was a big eye-opener for me. I've thought about this a lot, and I hope I get my accent right. Je vous salue Marie, pleine de grâce. Le Seigneur est avec vous. Vous êtes bénie en toutes les femmes, et Jésus de fruit de votre entrailles est béni. Sainte Marie, Mère de Dieu, priez nos pécheurs, maintenant et à l'heure de notre mort. Amen. Anybody speak French? Anybody know what I just said? Do you know? John, do you know? I just said the Hail Mary in French. Now, I was brought up a good Irish Catholic, and I go to French class every day, and we'd have to say that the first thing we did when we walked into the room. I only know that because I was made to learn it. I couldn't even tell you I could tell you what they were in English, but I'd have to do a little bit of work to cross over. I am not a fluent French speaker. I am not even a half fluent French speaker. But I can remember that from 25 years ago, 30 years ago. And it got me thinking, what's your Hail Mary? What's the thing? The Hail Mary, for some of us, can be something that we take as gospel, that we've learned it. But we've learned it by rote because we're meant to learn it. We've thought accidents happen because of this, but actually there might be other things at play. Or I've learned from this person and this instructor because they're the guru, and so whatever they say goes. I suppose the challenge or the action step is, what's your Hail Mary from this? Maybe go into this conference thinking there is no Hail Mary. Really question your own assumptions. The thing that I consider myself most fortunate and lucky about is that I've found other people outside this profession that were able to influence my thinking, and then in such a beautiful way, I came back into my tribe. By going out doesn't mean you're leaving. It just means you're going out to have a peek, and then you can bring it in. And there's a few people I just want to thank. If you're a geek and you want to read some pubs, feel free. I'll happy to send them through. But there's some people on the right there of that screen that have absolutely deserve enormous credit for, and others for helping make my life as enjoyable as it is, for helping me want to get on a plane and come here. And I couldn't consider myself more proud to be a member of this family. Thanks very much.